Good morning. I'm here with Alan. We missed the last podcast because of DEF CON. We were all so busy we forgot to do it. But now at least two of us have made it back. And Alan's starting with California's mega flood.
Yes, some scientists have done some modeling. They've looked at historical flood data. They've looked at future weather, climate change predictions, and they've concluded that the state of California is at profound risk for a mega flood, not just a flood, not just a lot of rain, but the kind of flood that would turn the entire Central Valley into a 300-mile-long lake, which actually happened in the 1800s, interestingly. So mega floods are not unprecedented in California's history, even in not too distant history, but there's a real possibility that thanks to climate change, there will be more atmospheric rivers that direct precipitation onto California. And we've had some atmospheric rivers in the past few years, but these would be far more profound. We're talking about maybe a couple of inches of rainfall per hour, and then those rainstorms going on for weeks, at which point the Central Valley will be underwater, and even the LA basin will be underwater. And we're talking about potentially $1 trillion of economic damage as a result.
And would it relieve our water shortage?
Well,
or would it still be not enough total water and it would all just run off and we'd be hosed?
Yes, certainly though the reservoirs would be full, and that would be a huge problem too, because the Oroville Dam had a big failure a few years ago. It didn't completely wash out, but the spillway had a failure, and that's an partially earthen dam. So, and there are others like it. So if we had a huge rainstorm like that, a rain system, not only would there be a tremendous flooding initially, but it's possible that some of these dams would wash out because there's just too much water. Even with the spillways, they can't dump enough water fast enough. And then we wouldn't be able to store any water. And then on top of that, the quality of the water we're getting might also be problematic, which relates to my second story that I'll be talking about today.
Yeah. So is there something we can do? Should we be building more dams and more gutters or something?
Well, in this study, they don't really talk much about that. But
Sounds like you'd have to do something really big.
yeah, I don't really know what you can do other than changing the topography of the state, though, because you've got low-lying areas and you've got a lot of water, and that water is going to go through those low-lying areas. So unless you change the amount of rain coming in, I don't see what you're really going to be able to do.
Yeah. Well, that the science fiction staple is that we actually start controlling the weather. That might be the thing to do.
Yeah.
Feed the rain so it rains up in the mountains where it turns to snow instead or something.
Yes, and well, that's another issue too, is that because of climate change and warming temperatures, we will be getting a lot of more rain in the wintertime. So it won't be snow. And the nice thing about the snowpack is that you get the snow and it remains snow until the middle of the summer. So you have the water gradually melting and being released into the waterways. But with the warmer temperatures, instead of snow, you're getting rain. And so that rain is just going to go straight into the reservoirs. So you don't have this slow release of water. So that's going to be a much bigger challenge then for water distribution in the future.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen it in Vegas. I mean, for a couple of weeks before DEF CON and all the time I was there, it seemed like one day out of every three, there are flash flood warnings and then big floods.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always been, so it is kind of crazy. You don't get enough rain and then you get too much rain.
Yeah, and was there much emphasis in the hotels about conserving water at Vegas?
No, there never is, of course, because you're a guest. But it did before we went there. There was big floods that rained down inside the casinos, and during DEF CON, there was another one that did the same thing. Flooded the garages. A guy was riding a raft out of the garage, and it was again flooding inside the casinos.
Oh, really? You saw this?
Oh yeah,
Oh, how
it's
exciting!
Yes, I was on the second floor of the Tuscany where it didn't, but I looked outside and all the roads were just rivers, and people are posting videos of it raining inside Caesars down through the lights and everything.
Hmm.
Apparently their roofs can't handle it,
Hmm.
and it pours inside the casino.
Mhm.
So they certainly need to upgrade the casinos, but also obviously all that water is being wasted. Roads all turn into rivers. And I don't think it goes into a reservoir or anything where they could save it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's tough. Well, I've got the voting machine stuff. So it turns out that not only did Trump and his gang and the Republican Party make these plans to put up fake electors, but a whole bunch of them made plans to conduct unauthorized forensic audits of these voting machines and to download data from them illegally. And now they're going after a bunch of them for that, who formed to secretly gain access to the voting machines and secretly download data from them. There are a few scattered cases of this, but now they're tracking it down as a big, effectively conspiracy. And I'm interested. It has a bit of computer forensic significance and legal significance. And one way to look at this, I'm often the fascist right winger by San Francisco standards. If you really believed that somebody was messing with the voting machines and hacking them, then you would have to sneak and get a good copy of the data on there to analyze it. And if you really believe that all the election administrators are corrupt and in on it, then you would do it in an unauthorized way. So, from their crazy premise, this is logical activity. And another one, which is also logical activity, is the one that happened during DEF CON. So OAN News sent reporters to DEF CON to go into the hacking voting machine village. And if you think about it from their point of view, DEF CON is where the liberals are practicing hacking the voting machines to steal the election. And they are there undercover to secretly record their nefarious plans, like Project Veritas. And so they snuck in without proper press credentials, and they tried to film without obeying the rules of DEF CON. And so they kicked them out and banned them, saying, you photographed people without consent, and you didn't identify yourself properly, and you're no good. And I'm sure they're going to see that as, this proves that they were sneakily hacking the voting machines, and they didn't want us to catch them. And, I'm sure that both sides are sure they're right and feel righteous indignation.
But I wonder about that.
Mhm.
These OAN types and these election denier types, some of them are just grifters. Some of them really have no conviction other than in trying to make a buck.
Well, I imagine you're right, but you never know anybody's heart. But I mean, certainly I think it's true that the Republican voters, something like 80% of them believing that the election was stolen, they're not grifters. They just believe the authority figures they like Trump and OAN and Fox. And they believe that there's a vast conspiracy. This is the problem. We've once an idea like this takes hold, it seems like an irretrievable blow to democracy.
Yes, well, the idea is certainly taken hold now. It is interesting, though, how the hackers of DEF CON are being painted as a bunch of liberals. And
Well, I think they are, as a matter of fact. Most
well,
of them are liberal.
I'd say there are different factions, different political factions within the hacker community. There are definitely some very, very left
Yeah.
people, but there are also some very right people, far right people.
I
So
think the left outnumber them by like 10 to 1,
probably,
which is true if you keep people. I think most people, that's the problem. I mean, from their point of view, it's not wrong to say, here's the liberals practicing how to hack voting machines. You could say that. That's not a great distortion of the truth.
Meanwhile, the Republicans bring in, what were they called? The cyber ninja, cybersecurity, so-called
right.
cybersecurity firm from Florida.
Yeah,
Total incompetence, didn't know the first thing about what they were doing.
Right. And so you can see, this is, like I say, most security professionals are on the left. Like in general, most educated people are on the left, because the right is obviously completely insane. And so when you find the few right wingers you can find, you've got lunatics that don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, that does seem to be the case here.
But I can see how from their point of view that just proves that it's a bigger conspiracy.
Yeah.
So I don't see how this can end.
They'll just need to get better hackers. Maybe they can recruit some from I don't know, Russia, for example.
Yeah, well, in the short run, what's happening is they are fouling up the voting machines, breaking the chain of custody. and creating the problem that they're worried about. Now people don't trust the voting machines because weird
this is
right-wing hackers have been sneaking in, messing with them.
This is true. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's just like all the Republican efforts to undermine government and the IRS is that they sabotage the government and the IRS. And so they work less well, which results in less public trust. And so it's just a feedback loop of diminishing public trust, further defunding, further dysfunction.
It reminds me of a bad divorce when you hate each other and now you start interpreting everything in the most negative way and everything you say just makes it worse.
Yeah, well, it does seem like some hard right types want to divorce themselves from this country for all their talk of patriotism.
Like,
They're
take a
not
look
very
at
interested in upholding the values and institutions of this country.
Yeah, and this FBI search warrant at Mar-a-Lago just shows the same thing. You could say they went in as politely as they could to recover this stuff, and you could say they terribly abused the rights of Donald Trump. And depending on, it's just a matter of attitude how you take the same data and interpret that.
Well, it does seem like one set of people is operating on a completely different set of data.
Well, it's mostly just an interpretation of the data. I mean, they went in and they took a bunch of stuff. And then they took his passport, apparently by mistake. And so now you can say those rotten bums invaded his privacy, or you could say
they take his passport?
Yeah, they did take it, three of his passports.
Oh, no.
And then they sort of had to give them back. Oh, we didn't mean to take those. And they say they were taking his passports to trap him in America, those rotten bums. It just depends on your attitude.
Well, as one political commentator put it, and I like it, the Trump supporters, the reflexive Trump supporters of America, every time there's some kind of controversy about Trump's actions, what the supporters will say at first is he didn't do it. Yeah. And then he did do it, but everyone else was doing it before him.
Yep.
And then finally, he did do it, and he's awesome.
I know. Yep. It's true. It's very much like any other cult. The leader can do no wrong.
Do no wrong at all.
And whatever he does is clearly the will of God and stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, anyway. All right. Let's hear about your forever chemicals. That's the next bit of rain.
Yeah. So if you were thinking, well, we're going to get a lot of rain in California, it's going to solve all of our water problems, we can just drink the water that's falling in California. Not so fast. You may not want to drink the rainwater. In fact, you may not want to drink the rainwater anywhere on Earth because, according to a study released by mostly scientists at the University of Stockholm, water everywhere in the world pretty much is contaminated with per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFASs. And this is a very extensive group of chemicals, about 9,000 that are used in mostly industrial applications that are very useful for lubrication and water resistant and oil resistant applications. So products like Scotchgard, like fire retardant foams, like certain lubricants, machine lubricants, also coatings on Teflon pans, Teflon nonstick pans. Well, these are all made with PFASs, these many different thousands of different long chain fluoride and carbon molecules. And the thing about PFAS is that they're colloquially known as forever chemicals because they just don't break down. They don't break down in the environment. They don't break down inside of bodies because of these very long fluoride chains. And so that means that once a PFAS compound is released into the environment, it doesn't go away. It remains, it stays, and it bioaccumulates. So animals will absorb PFASs through eating or swimming or whatever. And then other animals higher up the food chain will then eat those lower animals and then absorb even more. So it just accumulates the higher you go in the food chain. So animals at the top of the food chain, such as humans, well, now we all have concentrations of PFAS in the body. According to one study, 97% of all Americans have some level of PFAS in their blood. And this is a problem because PFASs are known carcinogens, and not just carcinogens, but they can cause other problems like autoimmune conditions and liver problems. So these are bad chemicals. And once they're in your body, they're not going away, they're staying. And pretty much everything you eat is also going to have more PFAS in it. And even the water from the rain is going to have the PFAS.
So if you get your water from a well, has that been purified somehow? I mean, that ultimately comes from rain too, right?
Ultimately comes from rain. I suppose some underwater aquifers have such ancient water that they have not been contaminated. But it's a good question. I wonder if PFASs are able to percolate into aquifers in many places. I don't
I
know if that's
would,
been studied, actually.
I mean, I would assume all the water everywhere has it, so there's nothing you can do, right?
Right. There's nothing you can do except it is possible to filter out PFAS.
Oh, so if you get like a Brita water filter or something.
No, not Brita. I think a reverse osmosis, if I remember correctly, reverse osmosis works too.
My sister lives in a building and they discovered it had lead in the pipes. So
Ooh,
she has a filter there on the
ooh.
water. And I think that's what it is. It's sort of a big globe on the tap.
I hope it's a good one, because the proper reverse osmosis systems, they've got like 3 different canisters and they've got little pumps and valves, and there's several $100s a pop, and rather complicated.
Well,
They're
as
not
an
just like Brita filters.
no, it's a little bit more than that. But we wouldn't have to take it down too much for adults. It's the babies that really have to worry.
Yeah.
Because we're going to die of something else before it gets to us.
I suppose that's one way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Although lead poisoning is a problem for anyone of any age.
It's not much of a problem for adults.
I'm going to avoid the lead
Oh, yeah.
myself. Thank you
Oh,
very much.
it's just as well to avoid it. But the fact is, if you're our age, and the amount of lead you're going to get from that pipe is not going to get you before something else does.
Well, yeah. I like my motor control just the way it is.
Yeah. You got to balance risk. Like,
I guess so.
since I recently discovered I'm apparently not going to die of cancer, now I have to diet because I'm going to have enough time to die of diabetes and heart disease. You got to balance these things.
Yes. Well, you can add PFAS to the mix too.
Well, that's the question. I mean, I know they lowered the so-called safe limit of PFAS by a factor of 1,000,000. That's what caused this.
Well, right. And so the US is, surprisingly enough, the world leader in terms of PFAS regulation, or I should say not regulation, because it's still being used industrially in the US, but in terms of quantities in drinking water. And so by those American standards, and also standards in some European countries, such as Denmark and Netherlands, there's no rainwater in the world that's safe to drink.
And from from information security risk management point of view, this is a useless thing to tell people. This is like that DHS threat level that's always orange. I mean,
yeah,
you have to have levels of risk, and you can't tell me that everything is too much risk all the time, or it makes me, that's useless information.
Yeah, it's kind of like masking and COVID, isn't it?
Well, if they tell you have to wear a mask everywhere forever, it is unreasonable. Yes, that's why I carried the CO2 meter, so I could judge the level of risk and decide whether to mask and how much to mask, and that seemed to work.
Yeah. Well, it's true that there's probably only so much we can do, and at 97% of the American population with detectable PFAS in bloodstream, both of us probably have plenty of PFAS in our bloodstreams. There's no getting away from that.
Especially because my parents had Teflon pans when they were new.
The thing about Teflon pans is that actually the PFAS compounds are driven off in the manufacturing process. So by the time that the Teflon coating is deposited on the pan, it's probably not going to leach any PFASs into the food unless you really cook the pan, get it extremely hot, something like 700 degrees.
Well, I know if you burn it, then it's kind of, well, so now the question is, how much is a level that will really hurt you compared to all the other risks,
And that part is not so well understood, but it's thought that really there's no safe exposure limit. And that's what the authors of this study are arguing.
Well, you could say that about radiation, right? One gamma ray might create cancer, but in fact, there is a level at which it is not noticeable compared to all the other risks.
True, true.
And
And the problem with studying environmental toxins such as PFAS is when you are doing a study, even a very large study, how do you separate out all the potential confounding variables?
right.
Um, but there have been some animal studies done, and there are correlations between people who have higher PFAS levels in their bodies and incidence of other serious health conditions. So there is clearly some relationship here. And given that PFAS only bioaccumulates, then, if you've got some in your body, you're only going to get more in your body in the future.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really matter where in the world you are. In the study, they had samples. They actually looked at a number of different studies. They kind of a meta-analysis. They drew on studies that conducted samples and everything, everywhere from Malta to the Azores to America to Antarctica to the Tibetan Plateau. And they found toxic, or they found levels, unacceptable levels of PFAS everywhere, including Antarctica and the Tibetan Plateau. So you
Well,
cannot escape it anywhere.
yeah, well, now they've quit using it for most applications in the US, right?
Well, for some, like Scotchgard, for example,
Right.
the EPA got after them about 25 years ago. And so now Scotchgard does not use at least one type of the PFAS, but
And
they're using it
Scotchgard is
differently.
anti-fire coatings on fabrics, right?
Anti-stain.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. But
Like
the
Teflon.
problem, right, exactly. But the problem is that there are so many different PFASs out there, and only a few of them have been properly studied. Um, it's possible that some of them are less toxic or non-toxic, but they all have this common chemical structure of a long chain of fluoride atoms with some carbon atoms at the end. And
Okay.
it's because of that long chain that they do not break down.
So maybe we should track down a filter that you can put in your house that would cut this stuff down. That might be a good policy.
Right. It might not be a bad idea because there are a lot of waterways and water sources that are contaminated. I mean, never mind the rainfall. A lot of industrial areas in the country and in the world have really severe pollution. Like I understand there's some facilities that manufactured Gore-Tex in New Hampshire that have a lot of PFAS pollution.
And I think about 7% of the houses in America have lead in the pipes.
Yeah, whether the pipes themselves or the solder used to join the pipes.
Yeah, so getting a water filter at home might be a good move.
Right.
All right. And so here I got a funny one. In what nation did they do this? They hacked into a satellite to play movies, and they did apparently this legally. Somehow they got permission. There was a geosynchronous satellite was being decommissioned and moved to a higher orbit, and it was spending a month in its original orbit. So in that time, they actually got access to a ground station that could transmit up to it and played like hacker movies and stuff on it for a month. And they streamed the talks at San Diego's hacking conference, TorCon, through this satellite they'd hacked into. And somehow they got permission in some nation to do this, which I'm not able to find in this article, but anyway, it's in Vice. So that's it's not that difficult to do, but what's amazing is that they actually got official approval to do this. They're not all having to hide and go to jail. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, this article really doesn't provide much information or many details on the hack, but it is very impressive.
Yeah.
I wish they'd been more public about this hack. Like,
well, I guess if you were at TurCon, you would have found out. I don't know.
Yeah. I see also that you need to have a hack RF SDR,
Yeah.
which is
well, that's the easy part. But then the main thing is you need like a big antenna.
And an antenna. Yeah.
Anyway, it's pretty cool that you can actually hack into a satellite in the real world and not go to jail occasionally.
Yeah, it sounds like just the thing for Caitlin.
That's what I thought. Yes. All right. And so you got the guy that made his own ISP. Now that's the real right to repair.
Yeah, there aren't very many heroes on the internet anymore, but there is one man by the name of Jared Mauch who apparently lives out in out in the countryside a little bit, and he wanted to have high-speed internet. And so he asked Comcast how much it would cost him to run fiber out to his home, and they quoted him $50,000. $50,000. And so he decided, well, screw that. I'm going to just make my own ISP with fiber. I'm going to do it all by myself.
How does he get to the backbone?
Well, this article doesn't get into the details, but the man does have some competencies, unlike most of us. He is a network architect and he works for Akamai. So if any layperson is going to have the competency to do this sort of thing, it's Jared Mock, I guess.
Well, I like the picture. He looks like he got himself 5 miles of fiber. I guess he dug his own trench.
Yeah, which is hilarious. He's digging his own trenches. He's buying his own equipment. He's pulling the fiber himself. Apparently, he's since gotten some contractors to do some of the work.
How would you get the rite of passage through all the land you're going through?
Yeah, I wonder about that too. He's done all this legwork. I don't think he has any employees. He's doing it all himself while continuing to work at Akamai, presumably full time. So it's really impressive that not only does he have the competency and the patience to do this work, but to multitask, do all these different things, because starting your own ISP, that does not sound like an easy task at all.
I would think you would do it with radio. That's how people have done it before. That's much more practical. You put up a dish and broadcast to the backbone from there, digging all these miles of fiber through everybody's land.
Yeah, Starlink just came a few years too late, I guess.
Yeah, Starlink is the obvious solution.
Right, but apparently he did have some kind of a wireless internet service. He was getting 30 megabits per second on this wireless service, and it just wasn't good enough for him.
Yeah.
But he decided to go all the way, apparently. And the interesting thing about this fellow is he does not live far away from civilization. He's not living in a tar paper shack in the mountains. He's not even living out in the sticks, really. He's in a rural area, but he's not that far away from some decent sized cities in Michigan. So $50,000 certainly seems like an excessive number. But the great thing is that not only is he building out the infrastructure himself, but he did a little bit of government hacking, if you will. He managed to get his local county to pitch in $2.5 million on this project.
Well, what you really need from the county is eminent domain.
Yeah, right. Yeah, which they don't go into. So I'm not sure how he even got that, but he seems to be figuring it out, and he's charging only $55 a month for 100 megabits per second.
Yeah, well, that's the thing to do it.
Up and down.
Yeah.
And then if you want a full gigabit, it's only $79 a month. And then there's
this is how the ISPs get started, like Sonic.
Yeah, but unfortunately, there are other big players in the area like Comcast.
Yeah.
And even though he got some funding from the government, so did Comcast for their infrastructure projects. So it sounds like he's going to be serving under 1,000 people.
Yeah. Well, hooray for small business.
Yeah. I mean, props to him.
Yeah. And the last one I've got here is one which I was reluctant to put in here because I still don't understand it. But there's a GitHub repository that provides time lock encryption. Now, I've read articles about time lock encryption going back at least 10 years, maybe 20. And this is the idea that you encrypt something that can only be decrypted at a specified time in the future. And there are a lot of reasons why you might want to do that, of course. Like, things are sealed for a certain amount of time and all that. But the question is, how in the world would you do that? And the original two ideas I found that I could understand are one where you just give it some incredibly difficult job to do, like cracking a password that will really take that long to do the processing. That would seem to be the most secure way, but insane, of course. And the second one is where you just have basically escrow agencies. You have a bunch of servers that have portions of the key, and they are going to refuse to let you have those portions until the right time. And then you're just trusting somebody. That's the general technique. You have a lawyer and they seal something and put it in a safe deposit box and they promise not to open it until this date. So it's not technically impossible. It's just a trusting somebody. And this new one, the newer ones though, I saw one that claims it somehow uses the Bitcoin blockchain. And this one claims it uses something that Cloudflare is part of that provides randomness on the internet. So it uses something called the League of Entropy testnet, which is some kind of cloud service to provide truly random numbers. And I don't understand how truly random numbers can somehow be tied to a specific point in time in the future. And they claim they've done that somehow with ZK snarks and other complex cryptographic entities. They link to 4 dense mathematical papers and say those are the foundation of this, but none of them gives me any simple explanation of how it is that it ties it to a point in the future. But it works. You can encrypt something and say, don't decrypt until this time. I'm going to try to decrypt it. It won't decrypt until that time, and then it will decrypt. So it is interesting that this sort of crazy idea that's been floating around now has a handy library in Go that will do it efficiently. And I cannot figure out exactly how it works or how secure it is or anything.
Have you tested this?
No, he has a demo, but what I'd really like is an explanation in simple terms of how it does the trick about the time. And all I can find is baffling, mind-bending complexity on that topic.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it would be mind-bendingly complex just by nature, but still, who is the person or people behind this?
This is just one guy right now, and I don't even see his name anywhere. But I think it's part of the DRAND project, and DRAND is the distributed randomization project. So that seems to be pretty well respected. That's like a lot of big companies like Cloudflare in on this thing to provide distributed source of random numbers on the internet, which I think ultimately grew out of the scandal from like 2000. I don't know if you're around for this one. Dan Kaminsky gave a talk about it at DEF CON. Canadian researchers downloaded all the public keys for all the SSH certificates on the internet and found that a whole bunch of them, like 1 in 1,000, were all using the same private keys, which means they're broken. And they wondered what was causing this, and they ultimately determined that it was because the random numbers people use are not random enough. And people were booting up routers and VPN appliances, and it would take so many milliseconds to boot up and then take the clock and make a random key out of it. And that had a pretty good chance of 2 of them hitting exactly the same number of clock cycles and ending up with the same supposedly random number.
That was a few years ago, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, like maybe 10 years ago.
Oh, 10 years ago. Okay.
But I think this caused people to get very upset about the quality of random numbers and start talking about some way to make better random numbers. And they added a hardware random number generator inside the Intel processor. And they have this cloud solution, the source of random numbers in the cloud. So that project, which seems pretty respectable, has somehow done this, which is somehow connected to their cloud random numbers.
So DRAND they're not charlatans.
No, as far as I can tell, DRAND is a serious operation. And I think this TLOC thing is a serious product. I just can't understand how it works, because if the numbers are random, then how is any particular point in the future the one where it can unlock? Mm-hmm. Somehow they've made that happen. And anyway, it's just something we should think about and start playing about. There are applications for this. And so it's like blockchain. It's a crazy little technical stunt that might be useful for certain things.
Yeah, this is interesting.
Yeah. And if I do figure it out, I'll mention on a future podcast and throw it in my cryptography class. I'm hoping somebody will write a description of this in simple terms. All right. Well, that's it for this one, and we'll try again on Friday.